Hello, everyone, and welcome to a very special episode of Cinderella Slippers. I am Braydyn Bear-Lents, joined by no other guest. Those guests will be coming around as soon as the college basketball season starts. This is the first episode of the series, and I was actually going to post one about the Indiana University basketball schedule, a little bit about some D2 competition, and some stuff like that, but we are not focused on that on today's episode. Today we are talking about the death of the greatest coach that has probably ever lived in the history of college basketball in Robert Montgomery Knight, who tonight will be honored with the Robert Montgomery Knight patch that Indiana basketball players will be wearing tonight against Marian University in Indiana. Today, in the last several days, it's been very, very, very heartbreaking and very difficult. I, of course, did not know Bob Knight. I saw his road at Texas Tech. I saw his road when he became the head coach of the Red Raiders. We watched Knight School constantly. And Bob Knight was what built this program. I've taken 3 days to really consider and talk about what was even happening, what was going on. It was an emotional day on November 1st. I was kind of numb that day. I prepared for this day for a long time. Dementia is a very, 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 very sickening and worsening disease. Dementia is tough. My grandmother had dementia for 5 years. We knew the road, we knew the journey, we knew where Knight's family was going to be taken. We knew exactly what was going to happen. We knew what was going to happen in Knight's life even way before we saw him back at the Indiana baseball game in 2019. Of course, in 2020, you have to consider this. February 9th, 2020 was the day that he had come back to Assembly Hall and got his last hurrah. 2 days later, my grandmother got her last hurrah. And one had died and one had didn't. But this, getting off the balance of Alzheimer's for a little bit, Bob Knight made Indiana basketball, shaped it, grew it, created it. He created the new image of Indiana basketball. We had won 2 national championships before him. But I'm going to say this, and I'm getting kind of emotional even talking about this because it is still emotional, and it is November 3rd. People talk about when the Cubs won the World Series 7 years ago, and this is something we're going to remember for the rest of our lives. As long as this planet is around and as long as there is no World War III or nuclear bombs or weapons, Bob Knight was everything to this program. Whether you loved him or hated him, he was everything to his program. This program would have not been the same without him. Boys turned into men, and men became the men that we had loved to see and loved to believe in because we all knew Knight's mission. Get them to graduate, get them to become successful, and get them to become transcendent parts of the community. This is not only one of, if not the biggest deaths in the history of this program, it's also a world, almost like a changing of the guards type of moment in Indiana basketball right now. Mike Woodson has a large expectation now to resemble of what Knight's character once was. And tonight's exhibition against Marian, we start the season on November 7th. We're going to play this season for Knight. We're going to play this season like we probably never played this season ever before. And I heard on a podcast on the Eye on College Basketball CBS Sports podcast, they did talk about how Indiana could possibly win the national championship. I do not think that is going to happen. I still don't believe that's going to happen because of how young this team is. How would they compete in NCAA tournament competitions? Knight would allow freshmen to do that. Maybe there could be a charm this year. Maybe there could be something that can actually rescue this team this year that could get them to the promised land. But we're not worried about that. We're worried about the arrangements, possible funeral arrangements that Bob Knight and his family would be planning. And to me, Bob Knight was either a horse's ass or a horse's platoon or the greatest motivator. Whatever you believe for him to be, And this is why I'm going to come onto the defense of the Indiana Daily student writers, who I actually work for the IDS. They did a masterful job at writing their article about the controversial life of Knight and about his success. He's a mixed dice. You do not know what you were going to get with him. You did not know what you were going to see out of him. And basically, you didn't know what his actions were going to lead to. So what I'm trying to say is that whether you loved him or hated him, whether he was controversial in your eyes or not, whether he was hateful or as shameful as you may have believed he was, Dan Dakich explained it right, which was Knight was not easy to play with, but he was a great motivator. He was the greatest motivator that's probably lived, besides Bill Walsh from the San Francisco 49ers or Vince Lombardi from the Green Bay Packers. I'm just saying, he's up there with those two men. Maybe I'd put in the mix Dick Vermeil or Bill Cowher or someone like that. But Knight was more motivational, yet very Shakespearean, as Bob Costas would say. And you either loved him or you hated him. He had flaws and he would be doubting himself and he would doubt others. He was his own worst enemy. And whether you enjoyed it or not, whether you was like my mom even mentioned one day, she used to view Bob Knight as a WWE character. Like the person you would see fight with Hulk Hogan and get up in the face and smack Hulk Hogan right in the face. So a lot of people here viewed him as a character. They didn't view him as real. They knew his anger would be here, and we loved it. We loved his winning tenacity. We would continue to die for it if we could. Hoosier hysterics. To this day, every single time you listen to the podcast, they're going to get rid of the podcast when they win another championship. I mean, whether number 6 comes or not, whether it's this year or 15 years from now, doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. What this matters is that Knight cared a lot about his kids. He tried to care, even if he didn't. He was vile, he was senile. It doesn't matter. This isn't about that. This is about the fact that what I'm trying to say is that whether you love him or you hate him, whether you didn't like him or you did, whether he was bad or he was good, there's a really, really beautiful painting from Vincent van Gogh. And it describes a lot about what we feel. Screaming, scary feelings. We don't know how to feel with this. Yeah, there were maybe 10 flowers outside of the 1976 mural at Assembly Hall. But what we remember Knight as, we remember Bob Knight as being that guy that led us to championships, led us to glory, but also was defeated and hateful. But also who was a Shakespearean trope, who you loved, who you respected, but who may have hated. You may have not liked what he did. But there's a lot of things that people have done over the centuries to do if they loved or hated Bob Knight. Anyone. You could have a family member that's like this. But I will finally close on this thought by saying, sometimes with narcissism, there are doubts in people that you may not like. Some things you will love, some things you will hate, some things you will not like. I've been around a lot of my family are full of narcissists, psychopaths. What I'm trying to say here is, you are not going to appreciate a person who is a narcissist, person you respect, but it's someone you have to work with and deal with if you worked for them at a company. These boys willfully signed up to join Knight and his crew to lead into championships and runs. But you have to remember that around the 1990s, his true colors were really showing. Miles Brand saw through him and got rid of him. Pamela Whitten has done nothing. The president of IU has done nothing but issue a one-page statement talking about how Bob Knight was and who he his character was to the IU story, to this fame of the whole IU 2030 thing. But if you have to consider the history, I consider the history. I don't know what you think, and I want to hear what you think. Comment on at Lents Braydyn on Twitter. Tell me what you think. Tell me what you believe. Tell me what you are thinking about him. Because sometimes, if you're ever around a narcissist, and you ever deal with a narcissist, and you ever deal with their rages, and you ever deal with their trauma and hurt, don't you have some judgment to know that sometimes you will love a narcissist? Or you will respect what they do? Maybe not even love them, but respect what they do? Sometimes you will. Sometimes you will respect narcissists for the qualities that they did possess that were good. Knight had a lot of that, and Knight had a lot of bad in him. Narcissism is a weird disorder. It's a weird personality disorder, and it affects a lot of people, and we could be walking around right now, and I'm spotting like 7 or 8 narcissists. I can tell you, IU has not been the same since. We need order from our students, and we don't have any. One time there was an incident where fans do stuff on the court, and Bob Knight got on the PA and announced to everyone that don't throw crap on the floor. So he was able to be a leader through his rages and disapprovals. But we don't care about that. We just, in the end, I don't even know if this is even making sense, but to any of you, but I'm just saying, sometimes with a narcissist, sometimes with someone you do not like, you just have to respect the qualities that they did have and respect the qualities that they do have that made your life better, not worse. You can't be sitting in a life of pity, and I don't see how a lot of players who were suffering would want to sit in a life of pity. It would be kind of devastating and lonely to even think about it. But I will say that you do respect the things that Knight did, that were respectful to the players, to the staff, to this community. He did a lot here. He did a lot here. He didn't do a lot in the end, but he did a lot for this community. He shaped Bloomington into what it is today, and he shaped IU to what it is today. So, final thoughts are rest in peace, Bob Knight. Rest in peace, Robert Montgomery Knight. He was born in 1940 and passed away in 2023. Before we get to the next segment, I will have a 10-second moment of silence to honor Knight's life, and then we will advance with the Gary story about my uncle who tried to get Bob Knight out of the river in Alfredsville. A very unique story. It's about 5 minutes long. And then after that, I'm going to wrap up with some closing thoughts. We're not going to talk much basketball today, but I would like to talk more about Knight, his legacy, and like I even mentioned here, the stuff you do appreciate and the things that you don't appreciate. But throughout this season and throughout the rest of the time that we're going to be playing this year, we'll be respecting Bob Knight's wishes. Here we are again with the 10-second moment of silence to honor the life of Robert Montgomery Knight. And just a reminder, this podcast is short too. We don't have much to talk about. We just have this to talk about, and then we'll advance to something else on next Friday, as the basketball season will officially begin. Anyways, here's the 10-second moment of silence. For today's very special podcast of the Cinderella Slippers story, I wanted to share this very impactful story about my Uncle Gary, who had passed away in 2001, way before I was born. And this story talks about Bob Knight, and specifically about what he did on one night in 1975 to get Bob Knight out of the river and into a place of more tranquility and respect. Because if you consider who Bob Knight was, he was probably one of the biggest drinkers in the history of Indiana basketball. Not only was he a big drinker, he made some mischievous mistakes. Many people don't really consider that Bob Knight was a person who had made a lot of mistakes, which he did. But this one mistake has never been spoken about. Of course, we heard about the fight when he was in the Soviet Union in the early 80s, and we talk about the time when he got into a fight during the Olympics, but this story was never really told until about 40 years later. This story involved my uncle, who was a car mechanic at what was known as Gary's Garage in the city of Lagodi, Indiana. We have a lot of family ties to the Knights, not specifically to Knight himself, but to the events that had transpired in this story. He not only tried to rescue Knight's car that night, Knight didn't really take into response of what he was doing. Knight was just drunk, and Gary was just simply doing his job. This story not only capitalizes on Bob Knight possibly having points where he could have rescued his own life, but this story talks about two men that were just simply doing their jobs. What if I told you that my late uncle knew Bob Knight on one night where he and him had one of the weirdest encounters that I have ever heard in a Bob Knight story? The year was in 1975, and up to that point, Bob Knight was just recently hired to Indiana University as of 1972. It was 2 a.m. on a September night when Gary and Jean Bell, my aunt and my uncle, were shuffling through paperwork in their mechanics shop in the city of Lagodi, Indiana, and what is now known as the Marathon gas station on East Broadway Street in the city, which is right across from a McDonald's. At this time, it was a slow night, but Gary got a call that meant nothing but getting to work. Jean, even though she was thinking nothing of it, just thought this was another call for Gary to respond to. The report was indicated that a convertible had crashed into a pond in the nearby city of Alfordsville, Indiana, just outside of Jasper. The car crashed off an embank and dived into the river, leaving the front seat soaked from the damage. Inside was just one occupant, as his car, soaked in the water but the front mostly destroyed by the impact of the water, was a very drunk, but yet not very out of it, Bob Knight. He kept on walking. He kept on talking. It was even shocking, even from Jean's perspective, seeing that he was even coherent during that period. The man that Bob Knight encountered was Gary, who, being who Gary was, didn't really care that much about what he was doing, but he wanted to write Knight a ticket to give to the insurance agency to report that there was an accident. He was just simply, in other words, doing his job. Gary offered to drive Knight back to Lagodi to pick up his car at one of the dealerships. He promised the car would be repaired in Lagodi at a separate auto repair shop. Knight simply nodded his head to him the entire time and barely spoke to him. Jean said that he was as quiet as a church mouse and only made jokes about board games, not jump shots. Then at around 5 a.m., a woman who we had known from the community walked into the mechanic shop to check on a car that she had previously left, I believe, the day before. Jean told her simply that you needed to pick it up early at 7 a.m. because Gary was out on a wrecker run. The woman asked, "With whom, I may ask?" "Some guy named Bobby Knight," she said in an exhausting tone. "Wait, are you saying that Gary is towing Bobby Knight's vehicle?" She was clueless. She did not know the X's and O's of the picket fence. She didn't even know who Larry Bird was. She never watched basketball, college or NBA, and never watched a single IU basketball game in person or on TV. Simply put, she did not know who Knight was. She didn't even know why he was even in Alfredsville after a night drunk late in the morning. Gary Bell would do his job that night, tow Knight's car and get him back to a location safely. There was no X's and O's on how to run the picket fence. Gary would just do his job for almost 40 years running Gary's Garage in the city of Lagodi. As for him, he made his history in the city, being the mechanic that everyone trusted, from our family to the families of so many others. Knight would also make his own history after 1975 on that night, drowning in 3 national championships, turning boys into men, and being in multiple tournament appearances at Army at West Point, at IU, and Texas Tech. When Gary, a former basketball manager at North Davies High School in the city of When Gary, a former basketball manager at North Davies High School in Odin, Indiana from 1960 to 1963, died in March of 2001, the story was hidden from us because my family doesn't really talk much. Gary bit his tongue a lot and barely spoke about the incident until in 1987 when he watched Knight win his 3rd championship on TV. He finally broke the story, and memories were later shared years later when I found out about the story in late 2018. This story I brought up to you was the story of 2 different sides. One person taking care of probably one of the most legendary coaches in the state's history, and another person who ended up being a legend and paving his own path in life. They both paved their own path in life. These 2 men both paved their path in life, both of which have passed away. But most importantly, this story defines a lot of who Bob Knight was. To wrap up this very short episode, now just to let you know that we will have episodes that will probably run over an hour for most, if not all, of the coverage that I actually post on a Friday afternoon. But just a reminder that the Cinderella Slippers will be on the podcasts on anywhere you get your podcasts every Friday. But today was a little different because, of course, it being the first episode and welcoming the college basketball season was not going to be enough for me today. It was going to be a lot for me to talk about Knight, his legacy, and what he has meant to this community. I will say that tonight, Indiana plays Marion at 8 p.m. tonight, and a lot of exhibition games were also going on around the country. Of course, Tennessee beat Michigan State 89-88 in what was a thrilling exhibition matchup. One that I really think was probably one of the best ones right now. Of course, there was the humongous upset on Halloween when Kentucky Wesleyan beat Louisville. And those 2 matchups that was the most shocking. Louisville needs a new coach, but we'll get on that next week. Of course, I don't want this to fully diminish what Bob Knight, his death, his passing, what that's meant for a lot of us. But I will say, to wrap up the episode, that sometimes in death you do have to talk about other things. But, of course, college basketball is in the full swing of things. Starting next week, November 7th, is when Indiana plays against Florida Gulf Coast, a team that last season went to the national championship. And not only that, but also created some noise and really put on a show last year during the tournament, even though I think it was a second-round loss. But we have some other matchups that will be going on. The official college basketball season for all ranked opponents begin on November 6th. So this upcoming Monday, so next Monday, of some of the matchups. And I know we're talking about this over Bob Knight, but a lot of these matchups really do not intrigue me. It's when we get more down. This Loyola Chicago and Florida Atlantic matchup on Wednesday, November 8th will be one for the taking. Expect maybe, if you want to see some preseason fireworks go on, Southern Indiana and Michigan State. I mean, USI over in Evansville against Michigan State, that could bring up some fireworks. Or another big one, John Brown versus Baylor. That one should be an absolute blowout. A lot of these should be blowouts. But then everyone has their circle, their keen eye on the Duke-Arizona matchup on November 10th. So that is next Friday, a week from now. And I will say that, of course, Kansas is the number one team in the country. In football, Ohio State is the number one team in the country. Ohio State is the number one team in the country. Again. And, of course, this basketball season is going to be really exciting. Not really one that many people will be talking about on the men's side, but of course it's going to be pretty exciting nonetheless this season. The men's game is not as exciting as the women's game, and the women's game is going through some leaps and bounds, which I will talk about that next week. But as of right now, we are seeing a lot of matchups. Like, here's a few matchups I see on here. LSU and Colorado in the women's basketball realms. Colorado hosting LSU could be one that could really define a lot of things for the season. Iowa could completely blow out Fairleigh Dickinson, and then the UCLA-Purdue matchup could lead to an upset. And this is also on the 6th of November as well. So next Monday is going to be really exciting. I might even come on here on a Monday afternoon, evening, and then maybe talk about the rest of the matchups going into Friday. Which Friday being the main episode where I have a guest. We don't know who that is going to be this week. But we got a lot of exciting things going on in the basketball world that I'm going to get into next week. So that right there is just like a little preview of what I was going to do. But to wrap this all up, I want to end it with one quote. But when my time on this earth is gone, the activities are past. I want they bury me upside down and my critics will kiss my ass. It's probably one of the greatest quotes that Knight has ever said. It's one that we'll remember for the rest of time. So hopefully Indiana can bring home title number 6 this year. Hopefully we can bring one more for Knight. Hopefully this season will be fueled by Knight's success. Like we talked about throughout the episode, a lot of people have a lot of things to say about him, whether good or bad. It is up to us to make our decisions and beliefs to what we believe is morally right and wrong. To believe is to believe that someone has a little bit of good in them, which you have to think that sometimes. Knight had some good in him. I want to close this off by saying Knight was the best role model in the city's history. We will miss him for the rest of time. More on Division II basketball will come next week. But yeah, this episode was dedicated all about Bob Knight, all about his journey. And next week we'll get started on some extra basketball. But yes, Bob Knight was born in 1940, died in 2023 on November 1st. May he rest in peace. May everyone do well this college basketball season. Begin craving, watching, sporting your favorite teams, because we got a lot of content coming up. Have a good night, everyone, and rest in peace to Bobby Knight.
Let me answer that. That is an absolute crock of you people in the news media, all of you dwell on some negative piece of like that. And I don't know how Steve feels about it, but it just and you don't have to bleep one single word of this. I had a friend one time that said, why had he become so popular after he became 85? And he said, because I outlived all those sons of that didn't like me. Just remember, when you're at a game and you see grass, it's the opposite side of the ball. But if you see hardwood out there, it's the other end of the floor. Try to help you young guys in this profession you've chosen that's 1 or 2 steps above prostitution. This is without question the most comfortable red sweater I've had on in 6 years. I can't tell you.
If it amazes you, then you don't know anything about basketball. You're illuminating your relative lack of knowledge of the game with a statement like that. Let's just start all this again. Now, I'm not here to argue the thing with you. I'm not going to debate things with you and people from television. You know, you want an answer from me, you get the answer. You don't like an answer, then don't use the program, okay? Probably no motivational device I've ever come across is as good as this. Boy, this is really good. See the blood drip out of it? You watch that. See that?
Patrick Knight is my all-time favorite Indiana player.
You only got 2 people that are going to tell you I'm not going to be here. One is our SID and the other is me. Who the hell told you I wasn't going to be here? I'd like to know. Do you have any idea who it was?
Yeah, I do, Coach.
Who?
I'll point them out to you in a while.
They were from Indiana, right?
No, they're not.
No, weren't from Indiana, and you didn't get it from anybody from Indiana, did you?
Could we please...
No, I'll handle this the way I want to handle it now that I'm here. You it up to begin with. Now just sit there or leave. I don't give a what you do. Now, back to the game. In my entire adult life, I've never used the expression game face. So I have no idea what it means or what you're supposed to do.
When my time on earth is gone and my activities here are past, I want they bury me upside down and my critics can kiss my...
SportsCenter's Top 10. Brought to you by...
This episode was from the Braydyn Bear Podcast Network.